In terms of AIS, how many of you have heard of AIS? Okay, so we're a cybersecurity company, primarily known for our R&D efforts with the U.S. government and various agencies within the government. We also perform testing and evaluations, incident response, forensics, and data recovery. We have folks that actually work out of the Defense Computer Forensics Lab in Linthicum, Maryland. And we also perform security assessment services. I see an unmanned vehicle system over there. And any given day when you come up to AIS, you'll see a number of engineers that are outside playing with those systems and hacking them and performing a bunch of different tasks against those units. Not only hacking them, but helping to make them more secure. So there are a number of different services and a number of different focus areas that AIS is involved with. But the primary concentration is in the area of cybersecurity. One slide doesn't do a whole lot of justice. We're headquartered in Rome, New York. We have 10 small offices throughout the U.S. We're incorporated in 2001. About 160 employees. Most have computer science degrees, but we do have those folks with cybersecurity and engineering degrees. We have two divisions, government and commercial. I lead our commercial division, which was started in 2012. As I mentioned earlier, most folks know about us as a government contractor or defense contractor. However, you may be surprised to know that on the commercial side, some of the largest businesses in this region hire AIS to provide security assessment services such as penetration testing. We also have a number of small businesses too in the region. And we've been contracted by folks in the automotive industry, healthcare industry, medical device, so on and so forth. So we've grown significantly in the commercial division, but we're probably a little bit less known in that regard. So today I'm going to talk about penetration testing. I'm sure most of you folks have heard about penetration testing. The overview I'm going to provide is very basic, so I apologize for those of you that either do this type of work or are very familiar with it. But it's my understanding it's a wide range of audience, and primarily I'm focused in the area of network penetration testing, not necessarily in systems exploitation or other systems. Today it's more focused on what we call network penetration testing. So pen testing is the ethical testing that's focused on gaining unauthorized access to internal systems and information. So if you break it down into its most simplest form, we identify vulnerabilities, we exploit those vulnerabilities, and we demonstrate the impact of those exploited vulnerabilities. And one thing that I often have to teach our engineers at AIS is we're not being hired to perform a pen test. We're being hired to proactively address and remediate issues to increase the overall security posture. A pen test is a means to accomplish that, right? And I say that because sometimes the engineers, they get so involved in what they're doing and they love what they're doing that they actually forget that, hey, we have a deliverable to this customer. We have to actually help them be more secure. We can't just be, finding holes and exploiting those holes nonstop. But that is really the reason for pen testing. It's a proactive assessment that's utilized to assess. Am I coming in and out of this? Proactive assessment that's utilized to improve the overall security posture of an organization, susceptibility of the infrastructure, systems, employees, partners, vendors, workflow, flow, and practice. I'll talk more about employees and humans as a whole because you'll see, if you don't already know, that they are and always will be the weakest link in any security chain. And when it comes to penetration testing, it's typically an easy way to gain access, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Can also help identify risks that are associated with a given vulnerability, impact and likelihood of a breach or breaches, and the probability of a utilized attack vector. And what I mean by that is we may find 5 or 6 different ways to breach your network or breach your environment and gain unauthorized access, but what's the likelihood of that occurring? And if it does occur, what is the real impact on the organization, okay? One thing I'll talk about down a couple slides ahead is what we call push-button penetration testing. There's a lot of tools out there that provide basic capabilities, and admittedly we use some. But what we found has set us apart from other companies is the human intelligence, okay? We actually understand what it is we're looking at, and we provide human intelligence against the data. We don't just run tools, spit out reports, and say, here you go, okay? And that's where when you get into probability of attack vectors and the impact of the attack, there's no tool that's going to do that. There are models out there that will help you, but really it comes from experience and understanding the data and understanding trends and the type of techniques adversaries are using. So of course the benefits of penetration testing are they can not only help you achieve but also maintain and demonstrate compliance against industry regulations as well as legal requirements. We have a lot of companies that hire us to perform what's called a PCI compliance penetration test. PCI compliance is credit cards. Okay? And so per the PCI compliance requirements, which is an industry regulation, it's not a government regulation, they're required to do a penetration test at least once a year or whenever there's significant changes to their PCI environment. Okay? It can also help reduce liabilities and expenditures in the event of a breach. Okay? And it's important to understand that there's no way to completely eliminate a breach from occurring. I think we all accept that right now. But if you can demonstrate that you were proactive and you put your best foot forward and you actually attempted to minimize the occurrence of a breach or the impact of a breach occurred, it can certainly reduce your liabilities and associated expenditures. Proper implementation, the first time and early identification of issues. A lot of times we'll have companies that will hire us to pen test, let's say their software or their hardware prior to going to market because they want to know what are the potential vulnerabilities. Right? They don't want to put this thing out in the market and all of a sudden vulnerability or vulnerabilities are discovered and they have to now build patches or pull the product back off the market. Right? So again, it's meant to help minimize the effects on the back end. What happens if you wait till it's too late? Well, I think we all kind of know that failing to be proactive, especially in this day and age, is risky and it's costly. Not only do you risk the exposure or loss of sensitive information, you risk losing assets and resources such as communications, your phone system, especially if they're voice over IP, your email server may go down, your web server, reputation and market share. How many of you have been impacted by this hack tied to Blue Cross Blue Shield? Is it Excellus Blue Cross, right? Whatever, I don't even know what they're called anymore, but I know I have been, right? And then there was another one that I was tied to. And I'm getting more letters from, was it Kroll for identity theft protection. At the end of the day, there's very little I can do in terms of switching away from Excellus Blue Cross because that's who our company utilizes. But in instances where I have a choice, I may not go back to them because maybe they haven't implemented safeguards or preventable safeguards. Okay, and then financial gains, profits can be, kissed goodbye because the cost of recovery is 3, 4, 5 times more than per instance than just a remediation, full-blown, proactive stance. A breach can, like I said, be too costly to overcome. We've seen instances where businesses go out of business. They can't survive it. Either the reputation is too damaged, and so they can't get customers back, or they just can't afford to recover from the breach. Right, it costs them too much. It's safe to assume that it can happen to your business. What we're also seeing is small businesses are very attractive targets to adversary. Why? Because a lot of them feel it can't happen to them. They're too small to be noticed or discovered, and they don't invest. They don't have awareness of security, and they don't invest anything into security. So oftentimes they're wide open. And again, a hacker or an adversary typically, right, not always, but typically tries to gain access and remain stealth and persistent. They're not looking to go in there and say, hey, we're here, we have everything. Why do they want to remain stealth and persistent? Because their goal is to exfiltrate data over a prolonged period of time at will. The more noise they come in and make, the more likely they are to get detected. And if you've seen with some of these breaches, I think with the Excellus one, that the breach actually occurred a year prior to them even being aware. So that's how stealth and persistent they can remain. So if I talk about a general approach for penetration testing, it typically consists of 4 main phases, and of course this varies depending on the engagement. But planning and preparation, information gathering, vulnerability identification, analysis, exploitation, final analysis and reporting, and then the targets are typically focused on your network infrastructure, applications, humans, workflow and practice, and physical infrastructure. All those sub-bullets I'm going to talk about in the following slides. Okay? So in the planning and preparation phase, this is where AIS or another company is actually hired to come in and provide these services. Scope and rules of engagement are established. And what this means is that we work with the organization to identify what targets are in scope and what targets need to be avoided. Any limitations to testing, meaning what exploits we shouldn't run, when to test, as well as contact information. Oftentimes, the customer, for whatever reason, doesn't want us to do any testing until the hours of 12 a.m. to 7 a.m. And there has to be a readily available contact. Because it's, on the commercial side, it's always me. So, they have my cell phone number, and if they experience any issues, they'll call me and say, hey, was this you? Fortunately, we haven't had anything come up where it actually was us, so that's good. Once we've established the rules of engagement and the scope has been defined, I'll typically get into what's called an information gathering phase. How many of you have heard of open source intelligence gathering? It's a fancy word for going out and finding out things about a target or a source, right? So this phase focuses on learning as much as you possibly can about your target. And adversaries do the same thing. They may refer to it as passive reconnaissance or reconnaissance, but it's against the target. And during this phase, your goal is to identify vulnerabilities within that target. Okay? And a vulnerability may consist of seeing what systems on your network are externally facing, configurations, maybe gently probing or scanning the IP address range and seeing what ports are open, what ports are listening. Names and descriptions and interests of employees, especially those key employees. Right? If I spent a few hours learning about an organization and learning about the employees to make myself smart enough, I'm confident that I can make some phone calls and within a couple hours probably gain access to some piece of information, whether it's over the network or it's conveyed by one of the employees over the phone or through email, that the company as a whole did not want released to the public, right? And then partners, providers, and vendors. This is important because as your organization grows, okay, I'm sure that even the administrative staff here at NVCC can't tell you about all the different vendors and partners that NVCC does business with, okay? So what stops you from putting on a hat that says you're the food service provider and walking in and sounding competent and confident and urgent in gaining access to not only the building, but eventually to critical systems within the environment. I know it sounds, hokey, but that's what we get hired to do, and it's kind of cool. We have the fake UPS drivers and everything else, and those kind of things. But it is again, part of a penetration test. Sometimes that's outside of the scope. Sometimes customers really want to evaluate their employees as much as they do their network infrastructure. So the vulnerability identification and analysis exploitation. It's a lot of words. It's basically 3 phases, if you will, but I just mumble them all into one because when you actually execute, you find out it is one. We identify some vulnerabilities, we craft up some exploits, we execute those exploits against the vulnerabilities in an effort to gain access. Maybe we have some success, maybe we don't. We get some new information that becomes available, and now all of a sudden we build a new exploit against an existing vulnerability, or we found a new vulnerability and we run exploits against that. But again, the goal here is to exploit those vulnerabilities and gain access. Okay? And maybe I should just back up a little bit for those of you that don't know in terms of terminologies. A vulnerability, and I try to use the door as an example. This door, a vulnerability assessment, is me looking at this door and saying, okay, if it's locked, can I potentially gain access? Sure, there's a window there. I could smash the window in and then push the door open from the inside and gain access. A penetration test, I would smash the window open the door and say, see, I was able to get in. So there's a difference between just a vulnerability assessment and a penetration test. You're actually exploiting the vulnerabilities you find in a penetration test. Any questions? So then we lump analysis and reporting, and again, this is where we've run into a number of disappointed customers because there is no requirement that you have to have certifications or experience in the area of penetration testing. You can buy some of these tools like Metasploit Pro and these other ones, and they're good tools. But again, it's the human intelligence factor that comes into play, right? So you not only try to summarize what it is that you did and how you gained access or where you didn't have success and and where the strengths and the improvement areas are, but also what are the findings. Try to establish criticality and probability against those same findings, right? And then of course recommendations to reduce the risk and manage the threats. Those are the things that really folks are looking for when they take on a pen test, when they hire for a penetration test. Now, a lot of you folks are probably going to be, if you get into the field of penetration testing, you're going to be down at the network level, actually interacting with the data, so on and so forth. You have folks like me who did that at one point, but now I'm the customer interface. I'm the one that all the engineers that I work with call stupid and dumb because I talk to the public, right? I don't know what I'm saying, and I get it. That's fine. But at the end of the day, my goal is to convey to them, here's what's working within your organization. Here's what's not working. Here's really what you need to do to protect yourself now and into the future. Any questions? Okay, so if we look at the targets that are out there, we look at the network infrastructure. It's responsible for the secure creation, storage, and transmission of information and communication. That is the backbone, right, of your operations. That is your infrastructure is what everything is built upon, right? It must always be available and it must always be secure. Those are absolutes because it can never interrupt productivity and profitability. I had one CEO at a large company say to me, I understand my network is full of holes. I understand I have 14 locations in foreign countries, some of which we are not close with. But I have not seen an impact on my bottom line, so why should I change? At the end of the day, the network's up and running. It hasn't crashed, and if data is being exfiltrated, they're not aware. Okay? It's hard to argue with that point. But if the network goes down because of a breach, of course that CEO is going to come down on anyone that's tied to IT because, again, it should always be up because if it's not, you lose accessibility, you lose productivity, which means you lose profitability. Okay? So some of the examples of the network infrastructure that are looked at, these are just a few: firewalls, routers, gateways, switches, servers. Of course, many of these devices are externally accessible. We can either, there's an interface that allows you to potentially log into them, or at least you can probe them to see that they're out there. And of course, applications, those are, in this instance, what I'm referring to is the ones that humans typically interact with, and are some sort of service. We see it with actual or potential customers, vendors and partners, employees, so on and so forth. I can tell you that with the actual and potential customers, a lot of these web apps, especially for insurance companies, where you either have an account and you want to log in and pay your bill, right? Once you, if you're performing a pen test, we may actually do some code injection, try to escalate privileges, try to not only gain access to additional systems within the network, but gain access to other subscriber or other customer data. And once you're there. So again, the goal here of this pen test is to exploit those applications to see what additional information or servers or services or systems you can gain access to. Because it may not be data exfiltration. I may just want to take you down because I'm malicious, right? It may not be about trying to steal the data. So I talked about humans earlier. Humans will always remain the weakest link within any chain. Humans have emotions. They're easily accessible, and they're prone to error. While software is prone to error, software doesn't have emotions. And it does typically exactly what it's designed to do. Nothing more and nothing less. If the software has a vulnerability, it's because whoever programmed it with that vulnerability in there. Okay. Humans can be tricked. We know this. Why would I spend days trying to exploit a firewall that's locked down when I could spend a few hours learning about some key employees within an organization and then calling some folks maybe in support departments like human resources, finance, contracts, or other departments within an organization sound credible, sound urgent, okay, to continue to gain information which will eventually get me into that organization. For example, I may call and say, I'm so-and-so from the food vending service, and I want to know who you folks are using because I will beat their price, right? Well, now I've just learned who their vending machine company is. So why can't I go out and get the same gear and walk in and say, I'm here to fill your vending machines? Now I've gained access to that building. Right? It's little things. It's all referred to as social engineering. Or maybe I want to initiate a phishing campaign you look at phishing in 3 different ways. Called general mass phishing, where I just send out a phishing email to anyone with really no random thought. Maybe it's made to look like First Niagara Bank, and for the couple people that actually have an account with First Niagara, you may take that email seriously, but for the rest of you, you're just going to disregard it. Then we have what's called industrial phishing, where I haven't targeted a specific organization, but I've targeted an industry, and I've used keywords within that phishing email that are going to make you at least look at it, okay, and be more susceptible to it, because it ties to the type of work that is going on in your industry. And then we have what's called spearfishing, where I've taken the time to learn about you and your organization, and I've crafted an email that looks authentic, that looks legitimate, and I've sent it directly to you. And spearfishing even can be me spoofing an email address. How many of you click on emails from your friends and family without inspecting the email address first? We all do, right? Well, you would never be able to get through your day if you had to inspect every email address. So anyone that says that they do it, I'm hard pressed to believe it. You must not get a lot of email. But certainly you can, rename an email address to appear to be somebody that you know is trusted, right? So my supervisor, if I got an email from my supervisor, I'm going to click on it. I'm probably going to respond because I want to keep my supervisor happy, right? But what if it turns out it wasn't happy? Right? So those are the kind of things that not only our adversaries may do, but what we do in pen testing too. Workflow and practice. Despite security best practices, policies, trainings, employees will often ignore common sense, utilize shortcuts, establish routines, place productivity over security. At the end of the day, if you're worried that your boss feels that you're not producing enough, right, or you're maybe slacking it, you're going to take shortcuts to ensure that you're productive. And typically those shortcuts will be foregoing basic security principles that you may take. Maybe you're so worried that you got to get stuff done, but you really got to use the restroom. So you just run away from your computer for a minute and go use the restroom, but you don't lock your computer even though it's a corporate policy. Those are little things, but again, they manifest over time, especially when you have multiple folks that are ignoring just basic security practice. By understanding the workflow and the practice of an organization, it's easy to discover many vulnerable points. How many of you have a job? Okay. So how many of you know what's great about that job? Some of you, right? But I'll bet a lot of you can point out what's wrong about that job and what's wrong with your bosses and your organization and the structure, right? As humans, we can easily do that. And if we look at practice within an organization, we can do the same thing. You can always find out what works well and doesn't work well, or you can always focus on the negativity. So then that really ties to the physical infrastructure assessments. Well, it's not always requested. Sometimes we'll be asked to take the information that we've gathered from human and workflow and productivity targets and implement that into a physical assessment. When are folks arriving and leaving for work? What doors do they use to enter, to go out and have a smoke break, or to eat lunch? How often are vendors, partners, and customers arriving? All this information can be used to physically breach a facility and gain access. Again, with a penetration test, the goal is to gain access to unauthorized access to these sensitive or to these systems and the sensitive data. And it may be a remote over the internet, or it may be physically breaching the security or the environment where the systems reside. So while penetration testing is one method, there are other ones. Okay, there are other proactive measures. Pen testing is not for everyone, and certainly not for every scenario. I can tell you that when customers call me, especially the smaller business, almost every one of them will ask for a penetration test, but they don't actually know what it is. And by the time we've gotten into an engagement with them, we're not performing a penetration test because it's not what they need. A penetration test, again, will attempt to identify and exploit vulnerabilities, but if you're a small business that doesn't have a large budget, maybe that's not your best option. Maybe a security assessment that I'll talk about, or a vulnerability assessment is a better option. Okay? We see businesses that are eager to sell penetration tests because you can bill a lot of hours, okay? But they don't actually consider what's best for the customer or what they need. And I tell you this as emerging students, that there's, you have organizations that need this because they have to operate and they have folks that they're accountable to, such as customers, which ties back to all of us, right? You have to look at the human element here. It's not just about, banging these customers over the head and making as much money as you can. It's about creating a safer cyberspace for everybody to operate in, okay? And so when you see folks that are selling push-button pen test or just trying to sell it because that's what they feel everybody can benefit from, it's not really a good approach to cyber information security. So I mentioned vulnerability assessments. If I have a company, for example, that is really small, maybe 25, 30 employees, but they store sensitive financial information, I always tell them, let's just assume that I can gain access to your data. There's no sense in spending money for me to gain access. Let's assume it can be done. Instead, let's do a vulnerability assessment where I look at all of your space and I attempt to identify as many vulnerabilities as I possibly can, and then categorize and rank the probability of those vulnerabilities. So I'm not going to exploit them because we're just going to assume that that can be done if I try hard enough. Instead, I'm going to look and say, here's all your vulnerabilities that we could possibly find. Whereas with a pen test, you may find a bunch of them, but really your goal is to exploit, not necessarily to find every vulnerability. Okay? Risk and threat assessment, security policies, employee awareness, training, and education. I can't stress that enough. Again, while penetration testing and these other services are great, the weakest link is always the human. So we have to look at how you can continually inform your employees without overwhelming them, without providing them with information that's above them. And typically what we do when we go into an organization is we just break it down to basic practice. Everything from using a shredder to locking your computer to not responding to a suspicious email to good social media practice, all things that, again, can help prevent an attack. And then security considerations during design. I mentioned this, how we oftentimes get retained to actually do testing prior to release. Even better is during design and development because that helps build a better product from the ground up. Any questions? I think I only put a couple people to sleep. Well, I'm Dan Kalil from AIS. There's a bunch of what I refer to as free junk over there, but apparently it's, what's the word? Swag? Yeah, our HR department got mad when they said junk. So. Well, thank you very much, and good luck this weekend.